Welcome to the first ever Chief Development Officer podcast with Charles Aris, Executive Search. My name is Josh Kotelnicki. I lead our healthcare finance and corporate development search vertical here. This is a podcast for all current and future Chief Development Officers, where we interview some of the top talent in the corporate development ranks today on all things related to running the M&A function. This is part of our broader series of podcasts called Executive Exchange, where we go behind the scenes with C-suite leaders in a number of our different core functions and industries. Today, we have as our first ever guest, Haley Schools. Haley's a Wharton grad, ex-investment banker, and two-time Chief Development Officer. She's currently the Chief Development Officer for Align ENT Allergy, which is a portfolio company of Zenith Partners, and we're extremely excited to get to visit with her today. Haley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Josh.
I gave a very high-level introduction on your background, but would love to hear you introduce yourself as far as the general journey of your career first, before we dive into some specifics.
Thank you, Josh. Happy to go into a little bit more depth on my background. So knew from a young age that really wanted to have a business-focused career. So I joked that my first business was actually reselling Costco bubblegum when I was in elementary school. So as I was looking at colleges, applied to Wharton, was lucky enough to be accepted to study economics. And I also had a second degree there in criminology. And, I wasn't sure for the first time, do I want to go into business or do I want to do something criminology related? And I spent my first internship working in the Justice Department. And I just loved how passionate everyone was. And as I was thinking about my larger career, I'm like, I need to find that passion. But I also was looking to develop a broader skill set. And I wanted to find a different industry to work in. So that led me to investment banking, because investment banking, it's just a great training ground, not only to get that analytical hard skills, like how do you value a company, but also those soft skills, like how do you communicate expectations? How do you build relationships? And I joined an M&A group where I was able to work across industries. I was doing cell phone tower deals, chemical deals, and started doing a lot of healthcare deals. And that's where I found that passion that I discovered during my internship. Like, I love the pace of change in healthcare, love that we're touching people's lives. Worked in investment banking for about 3.5 years, had a great experience. But where I found myself is, we would do these deals and I'd be like, great, like, did they get the synergies? Did they end up going and doing this other deal that now makes sense because they have this capability in their portfolio? And when you're an investment banker, you can't really work like that because you're moving on to the next client and you're not actually a member of the company. So that's what led me to looking at corporate development. And quite frankly, I didn't look at private equity because I wanted to be focused on one company. And I actually wanted to be the one executing versus hiring people to execute. That's what led me to Axia Women's Health. So I joined Axia in May of 2017, all-at-Ax portfolio company, physician practice management company in the women's health space, about 200 providers when I joined. And my remit there was really to lead the M&A function from scratch. And that really was the jumpstart for, where I am today.
Yeah. Well, appreciate the overview. A couple follow-up questions on that. I think we'll have a lot of people on this that listen to this podcast that maybe are in professional services today, transaction advisory, consulting, investment banking. You obviously did a couple of stints in investment banking. Talk to the listeners about your decision to leave. When did you decide it's time for me to move into a business? Talk about that transition and kind of what was in your head and a little bit what was in your heart as well.
Yeah, so great question. And I was in a little bit of a unique spot because at the time I was working at PwC's investment bank. And just pausing for a second, like, a lot of people don't know that PwC had an investment bank. It was just a startup when I joined. I was the first junior banker there. And we eventually grew to be a group of about 80 bankers. But given we were housed within PwC, we typically were brought in at the tail end of, let's say, a PwC or a strategy and consulting project. And if the end result of that consulting project was, you should divest this division, or you should go out and try to buy this capability, we would be brought in to execute on the investment banking side. And just given that greater context, what I found was that I really liked like that beginning part when I was coming in, like, so that's the strategic rationale for the deal. And you came to that decision by going through this strategic planning process. And I really love executing the deal. But then once you're finished, you're moving on to an entirely different company. And I found myself like really lingering on, well, what's next for that company that I was just working with?
Hmm.
And then the other component for me personally is I was living in New York City, really wanted to return home to Philadelphia at the time. So it kind of seemed like a natural break point to look for other opportunities.
Do you have a funny story for our listeners? A little bit of a horror story, maybe, as far as the longest day you had in investment banking, or maybe the longest weekend that you'd be willing to share with some of the junior bankers out there that might be living that right now?
Oh boy, like that brings back memories. So I joke with folks now that my longest shift in investment banking was 48 hours long that I didn't leave the office. And it was one of those just crazy pitches. Like that's like I'd say a key difference between iBanking and corporate development. When I was in investment banking, we worked on a lot of, I'll be generous and say creative pitches for business that
Hmm.
had very, very low likelihoods of success. Whereas in corporate development, like we still have that same level of creativity, but all the things that we're working on generally have a higher level of actionability and nowhere near 48-hour shifts.
Well, I'm sure there's some people out there that can relate. So appreciate that. Let me ask this in terms of mentors and role models, not just from investment banking, but maybe at Axia, people that had a big impact on you, and maybe a story or two that mentor kind of said something to you, or in the heat of a long weekend, like you just said, kind of working through a deal, some coaching you got when you were a more junior banker, just people that had a big impact on you as you came through your career and kind of what they passed along.
What I'm thinking about, Josh, is when I was a junior banker, there was this one vice president who really influenced me. As an analyst and even as an associate, you're really in what I call task orientation mode, where it's like build the model, build the sim, fill out the data request for the data room. It's all very mechanical.
Mhm.
And when you're working on just that large volume of work and you're not going to finish until midnight, 1 a.m., it's hard to just set that aside for a minute and think about what's the larger picture here. And this vice president, like we were working pretty hard on, at this time we were answering a due diligence request, like in the midst of helping the different buyers come to submitting their letters of intent. And as we're looking through the questions, I'm just, mechanically answering them. And the vice president just said, hey, like pause for a second, like look at this one question when they're asking, like, hey, does the business have this capability?
Mhm.
Yeah, the business doesn't have this capability today, but rather than just saying, no, the business doesn't have the capability, let's think about why is the buyer asking that? And is it because they're trying to see if our business can serve this other end market? Because if so, like there's other capabilities we have that the buyer might not be thinking of that we should highlight in this question. And even with questions that might seem at first very straightforward, you always need to be thinking in terms of always selling.
Mhm.
And that certainly translated into corporate development as well. Like as I think about always selling, like when folks come to me and especially like position targets with particular questions or concerns, I always try to take a moment and truly think, or even ask them directly, what's driving the concern? Because sometimes it's not as straightforward as the initial question may lead you to believe.
That dovetails on the next topic I wanted to bring up along those lines. In terms of what's the biggest thing you learned moving from investment banking into corporate development, or maybe there wasn't anything that was dramatic, but is there anything that once you were sitting on the other side of the table that was really enlightening or really kind of a perspective shift?
Yeah. So there are two things that I'm thinking about, and they're both people related. So firstly, when you're working in investment banking, like oftentimes it's a lot of folks who went to top schools, highly motivated. And as I was just thinking about investment banking, like typically like I'd send an email to someone, almost 90% of the time, I'm going to have an email response by end of day.
Mhm.
Things just kept moving. When you go into corporate development, you see really, I'll say like a wider range of people. And not everyone is going to have the desire or the capacity to respond to what you're looking for in your time frame. So what that means is being a lot more thoughtful in the way that you structure and plan for work. So for example, when I was in investment banking building SIMs, I could say, you know what, I'm going to send the data request to the company on Monday. They're going to get it back to me Tuesday afternoon. I'll work on it Wednesday. In corporate development, I generally have to allow more time when I'm requesting information from targets or even from my greater team at Align or back when I was at Axia. And then secondly, And it becomes more important as you become more senior in investment banking. But I would argue in corporate development, it's important even when you're relatively junior, building relationships. And it's relationships with everyone. So for example, I built a really strong relationship with the executive assistant at Axia. And when I did have very time-sensitive questions for our leadership, because I had this strong relationship, I was able to snag those 20-minute calendar spots that become available short notice. Versus if I didn't have that relationship, I probably wouldn't have been prioritized for that.
Why don't we transition, Haley, let's talk about a little more in detail your time at Axia and your journey there from, I'm not sure what you came in at, but eventually you became the chief development officer. Maybe you started as a director or a manager, moved up to a VP. Talk to the listeners out there as far as where you started, what your responsibilities were, and kind of how those morphed as you moved up in the organization. And maybe also talk about a little bit what you attribute your successful rise to. Did you work harder than everyone else? Did you you mentioned relationships earlier, right? Did you do a better job than maybe some of your peers developing relationships with physicians? Was there an element of fortune to this where I was kind of at the right place at the right time? Talk about the come up at Axia.
It was a variety of factors. It was a very unique role. So I joined at the manager level. And typically when you join at a manager level, that's part of a larger organization within the function. But as a manager, I was in charge of leading the corporate development function. And when I initially joined, there were no other members of the team,
Gotcha.
which was a fantastic opportunity because I was able to create from scratch a corporate development process from sourcing to how do we pitch the targets, how do we value them, and get that valuation consensus with our private equity firm and our leadership team to how do we build a diligence process that brings in the different functions within the company all the way up to closing. And as I think about, how did I get promoted to chief development officer? So part of it was continuing to professionalize the process and always innovating. So even let's say 2 years in, I had a process that was going pretty well. I wasn't satisfied with that. I was always looking at my metrics saying, okay, well, if it's taking me on average 100 days to close a deal from the time I sign an LOI, how do I shave 10 days off that? Like, what could I do without sacrificing the quality of my process? Other part was building relationships with the rest of our executive team, really communicating actively. Here's where our pipeline is. Here's where our M&A strategy is. Actively soliciting input, making changes accordingly to that input. And, the other part here is, and it might go without saying, but in order to become chief development officer when you're starting off, you need to have a track record of success. So by the time I was promoted to chief development officer, I had closed over 30 transactions. I'd successfully onboarded a director who had closed transactions of his own, started creating an organization beneath me. So in many ways, I was operating as a chief development officer even before I got promoted and formally got the title.
Right. Talk to us about the importance of working well with other functions in the business. Maybe just lessons learned on working with operations, right? With finance. Talk about that a little bit. What you learned as a young corp dev professional in that regard.
That is actually the most important part of the M&A process, involving the other functions. And what I always tell folks is that you can have the best deal, best acquisition target, get it at a really low multiple. But if the greater team can't integrate it, or if that integration doesn't go well, it can be the worst deal you've ever done. And in terms of working with the different functions, I really see it two ways, potentially a third way, actually. So the first way is they're experts in what they do. Think about billing within a PPM context. I'm not an expert on coding by any means, but my director of billing is. And having him really partner with me on diligence, he can catch things that I wouldn't be well positioned to catch. And that's very important when you're thinking just in terms of valuation and sometimes whether you would do the deal at all. Then secondly, you want to make sure that when the acquisition comes aboard, it's really a smooth process for integration. And the best way for that to happen is for the integration planning to start well before closing. I would say even 90 days out, you want to start doing that preparation introducing your team to the M&A target, et cetera. And really, like, the third thing is I think about the different functions is I build really strong relationships with my M&A targets.
So, Haley, what's the biggest difference between being in the chair for the first time as a chief development officer versus being a director or vice president reporting up to someone? What's one of the first things you noticed?
The way I think about it, it's if you think about just like a jigsaw puzzle, like the directors are each filling in perhaps like their corner of the puzzle, but they can't see what the full puzzle is. As
Mhm.
chief development officer, my main responsibility that I wouldn't have had as much as when I was a director is how do these pieces fit together? And more importantly, how should we prioritize them?
Mm.
So, for example, one of the ways that I had structured my team is I had one person who was focused on subspecialty deals and one person who was focused more on our core bread and butter OBGYN deals at Axia.
Mhm.
But then the question is, well, which one do you prioritize? How do you resource the two? How do they work together? Should we be even looking at a third thing? Like, should we be starting a small venture capital fund and be doing fintech investments? And that resource allocation, seeing how the pieces fit together at a high level, that's really critical for being a chief development officer. The other area where I would say it's different is you think about just high level M&A strategy. It almost morphs into marketing.
Mm.
I think of the CDO as a steward of the company brand. And as the steward of the company brand, you're typically attending more conferences, you're working closer with the chief marketing officer versus a director who is more in the day-to-day execution.
All right, so I want to come back and we'll spend more time and a couple more lessons learned from your time at Axia, but you are now on your second stint as a chief development officer. What are you doing now that you weren't doing the first time? What have you improved on?
In terms of what I've improved on, and I'll just go through each stage of the M&A process. Sourcing, I'm collaborating with marketing much sooner than I was at Axia. We're building the Align brand, we're sponsoring conferences, and I'm really amplifying that reach through sending personalized emails to M&A targets. And already it's been resonating. I was at a conference just earlier this week, and one of the targets said, yeah, like I saw you were a gold sponsor and I went on your website. I learned a little bit about what you do. I mean, really eager to learn more.
Mhm.
And when you move into like the next phase, like the valuation and diligence phase, I created really a playbook in terms of here's how we're going to think about valuing the practice. Here are the different diligence streams we're going to do. And while I did do that at Axia, it was more of an ad hoc process. At Align, we really took some time to think about, okay, like what do we want all of our templates to look like? How can we make sure that this is strong, repeatable process? And then the third area was really in terms of team development. This I wouldn't necessarily say is a lesson learned, but each organization is going to be different. And as you think about just building your team, it's not going to be the same team for each company.
Yeah.
When I was at Axia, I had some great sourcing advantages because we had strong brand recognition and we had 200 doctors who were eager to provide referrals.
Mhm.
And quite frankly, we were swimming in deals. I needed executors on the team.
Yep.
At Align, it was really more of the opposite, where given we were so young, we needed to fill the front of our funnel. So as I was looking to build the team, I focused more on a sourcing capability rather than an execution capability.
Fantastic. So if you stepped into give some advice to future chief development officers out there that are trying to put together a playbook before they're sitting in the chair effectively. New role today. You start a new chief development officer role in another company today. What are you trying to accomplish in the first month? What are you trying to do in the first quarter? What are you trying to do in the first year? Give a template, if you will, to some of our future CDOs.
In the first 30 days, and really I'll say like more like the first 2 weeks, you want to build relationships within the company. So for example, get to know who are your other functional leads and also just like a few of, I'll say like the key operators. If you're in a physician practice management business, for example, getting to know a few of the key doctors within your company. You want to understand your industry. Where do people in your industry come together? Who are the key opinion leaders?
Mhm.
And then toward the end of the first 30 days, like you want to be setting up a plan for you to get involved in that ecosystem. So like going back to ENT, I had a list of the conferences that I wanted to attend. I knew who some of these more prominent physicians were, and I was trying to get warm relationships to them. And then
Mhm.
also in the first 30 days, like it depends on just where your company is in development, but you want to do a SWOT analysis of the corporate development function. So if you're like me and you're coming in from scratch, it's not as relevant, but you want to see, okay, like where are my capabilities on sourcing? Where are they on execution? Where are they on integration, if that's part of the role? And where can the private equity firm potentially pitch in and provide some stretch capacity? Because like what you want to be shifting to as you start to get to that like 30 to 60 day mark is building out, like I'll say, minimum viable products of your tools. So from sourcing, you want to build out a target list if you don't already have one, or you want to verify the list you have. You want to align with the private equity firm and with the rest of the executive leadership team. And how are we going to talk about the pipeline? How are we going to evaluate acquisitions? How much time do we need to do that? And where I generally like to be is toward the end of the 60 days, I'm presenting really like kind of like a mini plan to the CEO and to the private equity firm saying, hey, like, this is how I see the corporate development function today. Here's my vision for it as we move year out, 3 years out to exit. Yep. And just really iterating on that and aligning on what is the budget for the first year here, and understanding that there might need to be some flexibility if you're a younger company and don't yet know like how competitive these processes are going to be. And as I think about the first year, like you want to be in a position where you have, I'll say, like a well-staged pipeline. Because what can happen when you're a small team is your pipeline gets bunched. Like you start focusing on sourcing because you don't have any deals. All of a sudden you have a lot of stuff that you've sourced, and then it's all going through the pipeline at the same pace, and that causes jams. So even though it's very tempting to have that happen, you should stop and think about what's the distribution of my pipeline. And you should aim such that at the end of your first year, you have, probably a good quarter of your deals like near the finish line, post LOI in diligence. You have like probably another half that are in like somewhere in the post NDA, but not at LOI stage. And then the remaining like quarter to a third in your exploratory early pipeline stage.
Yeah. Talk to me about, so knowing what you know now, things you would have done differently back to Haley Schools when she was a young manager right out of banking at Axia. Advice you would give to your younger self about starting to prepare differently to be a CDO. And specifically, you mentioned skills about sourcing. Would you have done anything different to try and get more exposure to that early in your career? Execution, of course, we could talk about that. You also mentioned integration. Just maybe give some advice to young, managers, associates, and directors out there. Like, if you could do this all over again, I would spend more time on this skill, because that was something I had to really work on by the time I got into the seat. Like, where would you spend more time if you were younger and could do it all over again?
I would spend more time talking to people, quite frankly. Because so much of what you do as a CDO is building relationships, and you never know where a relationship will lead. Like, I'm still amazed where, I'll see somebody at a conference and I'll be like, wow, like I actually worked with you all the way back in investment banking, and now somehow you ended up in the same space and we could potentially help each other. And building relationships, that's a muscle that you can practice over time. So in terms of like concrete things you could do, or that I could have done, is when I was a manager, like I wasn't attending any of the women's health or M&A conferences. If I had started doing that, I could have built even more relationships, or even like, potentially more importantly, like I could have tagged along with some of our senior executives who probably would have been open to me joining, and see like, how do they work at conferences? How do they make different connections? That I think is very critical.
Yeah, it's insightful. Let me ask you a question. So in terms of, look, anybody who has a computer can kind of look up the success you guys had at Axia. Very successful exit, of course, financially. Audax to Partners Group. Let me ask you, what are you most proud of from your time as a CDO at Axia?
What I'm most proud of is the team that I built. I started as an individual contributor for about 2.5 years. By the time I exited, I had a team of 6 people. And part of my leadership style is what I would call like empowerment, really understanding, as I brought each team member on, what are their strengths? What are their development areas? And more importantly, where do they want to go? I always joke with my team that there really isn't a corporate development team, because our role is so cross-functional and we learn about so many different parts of the business that we're really like that auxiliary member to everyone else's team. And you could work in corporate development and then be able to transition to a variety of different roles and different industries. And as I look back now, one of those team members is now a CEO of a medium-sized company. Another one is leading corporate development at a different roll-up. And I'm really proud to see that they've all developed into very strong, capable leaders. It's kind of funny. Like when I went into corporate development, I was like, I want to really build on a company strategy, see how a series of deals evolve. And then once I started managing people, I was like, this is really exciting. I want to see like, how are these team members going to evolve and how can I help them get there?
Yeah. Haley, great advice so far. Give some cautionary advice to some of our type A up and coming corp dev candidates that at all costs are going to move into their first chief title as fast as humanly possible, right? There's obviously some businesses are better positioned for success than others. Some are better platforms than others. Maybe pass along some wisdom that either you've experienced yourself or learned from others about things to assess when you're getting the chance to interview for your very first chief development officer role.
I'm glad you asked that question, Josh, because as you think about your first role as chief development officer, you really need that to go well. Because if you don't have a good outcome, it's going to be hard to convince other folks that it was because of external factors. So as I'm thinking about that first interview as a potential chief development officer, it's a two-way interview. And you're doing as much diligence on the company and the opportunity as they're doing on you. You want to understand what is the M&A expectation. And then once you know that, you want to think, okay, like if we hit that expectation, will that actually be a good exit and successful for the company? You want to think about, is there actually enough M&A out there for you to be able to hit that target? Because it's a different story if the universe is so big, you have to just win 5% of the targets versus if you have to win 50%. Another component I would look at is the private equity firm. Do they have the capital and do they have the desire to support you? Are you going to have the resources you need? Because there are a variety of different corporate development roles. Like you could come in as a chief development officer and still largely be a team of one focused on sourcing with the private equity firm doing the analysis. Or it could be a more traditional functional role where the private equity firm is more in the background and you're building out a larger team. And if you find a role that you find pretty exciting, but you have some concerns, like your diligence didn't come out clean, like I would encourage folks, like it's okay to start as a senior vice president or a vice president, because that gives you more career flexibility. Because if you go in and you do really well, you can get promoted to chief development officer if they don't hire in somebody over you. You want to make sure that you're leading the M&A function. But if you come in as chief development officer and you find that there isn't as much M&A as you expected and you're looking to transition to a different company and that was your first stint, that's more difficult.
Gotcha. Good advice. Let me ask this. It's this little bit of a personal topic, but I think it's important. I imagine you do as well. Female corporate development professionals represent 10% of the total talent pool out there. It's something we're pretty familiar with here. We have that data here, Charles Aris. I don't think I'm sharing anything with you that you don't already know. But my question for you would be lessons learned and thoughts on being a female in the corporate development environment in general. And then, of course, any advice you'd pass along to other female corporate development professionals on the come up as they move up through their careers.
I'm just reflecting on the statistic that you shared, Josh, and it's crazy to me that in 2024, that statistic is still only 10%, but it reflects my experience as well. As I think about just my personal journey. So I think part of the perception of women, both banking, M&A, is that we're not aggressive. So what I would encourage women who are thinking about a corporate development career is be self-reflective. Think about what are my strengths? Where are my development areas? And I would make sure that, when you're in meetings with other executives, that you come in prepared to be confident and with supporting points so that you can give your opinion and have credible support beyond it. And I would also say that like when you're out there doing sourcing or doing follow-up, my gauge on whether I'm doing enough follow-up is I should be slightly uncomfortable. I should think that I'm being slightly too pushy because generally I found that that's where you've had the highest chance of success. And if you are less of a quote unquote aggressive person, that can help you correct for that. Other area, and I mean, this isn't even like necessarily limited to just women, but as you think about just different M&A targets, like you can win M&A deals based on price, but a lot of times price is going to be outside of your control. Like you're going to have to pay like market prices, or maybe you're even paying below that due to, capital constraints. And one of the other ways that you can win deals is through relationships. And I spent a lot of time researching each of my M&A targets. And most of my M&A targets, like my average one might be like a 4-physician group. And typically, most of the physicians are older males. But I look for other ways to connect with them. Like, are they huge skiers? Can connect through that. And it's really just about building those commonalities so that gender fades more into the background.
Yeah. All right, Haley, this has been fantastic. Let's move into a section that we call Deal Talk. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to rattle off an answer on these different topics. Again, targeting a number of different issues that come up for corp dev professionals. Let me start with this. First thing that pops in your head when I ask you about your favorite deal.
Unleashing capabilities.
First thing that pops in your head if I talk to you about deal that got away that you still think about that bothers you.
Underestimated the competition.
First thing that pops in your head if I said trickiest financial issue you've had to deal with in your career.
Sudden change in the business, loss of customer.
Trickiest non-financial issue you've ever had to deal with.
Family members in the business.
Lessons learned in presenting to the investment committee.
Understand the greater ecosystems around your acquisition and have someone on your team to be the devil's advocate and poke holes so that you're prepared before you go in front of the committee.
Lessons learned on getting internal buy-in on a potential deal.
Involve your operations team as early as possible.
Lessons learned, maybe from your more junior days, on the quantitative analysis, QAV, modeling work that needs to go into every deal.
Whenever you build a model, give at least 24 hours, then review it again before you share it with someone else.
It's good stuff. Haley, on behalf of our firm, just want to say thank you for participating in our first ever Chief Development Officer podcast. Folks, if you want to dialogue with Haley Schools or reach out to her, you can find her on LinkedIn. She's had a fantastic amount of success for someone her tenure, and I expect more big things to come. And Haley, just thank you so much on behalf of our firm, as well as all the corporate development professionals out there.
Thanks again, Josh. I had a lot of fun chatting with you.